continuing my Careers During COVID-19 series, helping our audience understand how this pandemic is impacting careers and workplaces in global development. Today, I am delighted to be joined by my Devex colleague and Brussels correspondent, Vince Chadwick. Vince has been reporting on many of these issues, including digging into the findings of our COVID-19 Trends Tracker Survey. It's a mouthful. Where each week we ask development professionals to share with us how this pandemic is impacting development work. Today, I want to talk to him to understand what we are learning in these surveys and what he is hearing in his conversations. So Vince, thank you so much for joining us today.
Pleasure. Hi.
So this week, Devex broke the news that Oxfam laid off 30% or will be laying off 30% of their staff as part of a big restructure that was certainly expedited due to funding cuts as a result of COVID-19. In our Trends Tracker survey, we asked about this, and a majority, 55%, said they were concerned their organization would not financially survive the pandemic. 57% were concerned they would lose their job loss. Obviously, we've already seen some of these job losses. So what are you hearing and seeing in regards to job losses in the sector?
Well, first of all, it's perhaps a word about the Trends Tracker in general. This was started as an idea. We wanted to hear from our readers what they were experiencing in their professional careers at this unprecedented time. And so we asked about 500 people once a week in about 150 countries, NGOs, independent consultants, donor agencies, and people from independent consultants, but also people from development consulting firms, for a whole list of things, about 10 questions, what changes they were seeing, what they were worried about, things like that. And I'll get into that in a second. But what's really valuable about this is we've got a fairly good spread of different areas around the world. And so in answer to your question about what we're seeing about concerns, I think everyone would expect there to be great concern, and certainly the sad news about Oxfam is the most recent example of that. But the concern's actually different around the world. So in some of the statistics, which we've got an article coming out next week on this too, those concerned that their organisation might not survive the pandemic, 39% of the respondents in Africa were very concerned that their organisation might not survive, but only 6% in North America were concerned that very concerned that their organisation might not survive. So a similar trend, if you like, we can see in those knowing someone who has lost their job. So in the month that we've been doing this, I mean, it's increasingly useful week by week to be able to draw comparisons over time. So in the month we've been doing this, we've seen the people concerned, the people who know someone who've lost their job, go up from 36% to 43% overall around the world. Still very high. But in Africa, that figure's 46% this most recent week. In the Middle East, it's 56%. But in North America, it's 32%, and in Europe, it's 36%. So it's in a way, a manifestation of this trend that we've been seeing throughout all of our work in the last few months, is that this crisis is affecting certain regions more than others, even though it's affecting us all.
Oh, yeah, those are sobering numbers. And I think even as you hear about these job losses and obviously how devastating they are to the organizations and individuals impacted, perhaps even more disturbing is that that's a signal of the funding cuts that drive those job losses, which ultimately are going to really impact the most vulnerable. And really interesting to hear that many of the job losses are being felt greater in some of the countries where they are the most vulnerable. What are you seeing? I know there are some new funding available for COVID-19, but obviously many organizations are still struggling to weather this crisis, continue critical services. What are you seeing donors doing to help address this? And what are people saying they want donors to do more of? I know you wrote a piece about this recently.
Yeah, so there's a few things. It depends who you are, I suppose, in those list of people, respondents that I listed. So if those running large consultancies in Brussels, working mostly with the European Commission, European Union, they want to see the European institutions release a whole lot of call for proposals, because they've got a whole lot of staff who are stuck at home and they need to keep working. And so they need the pipeline to keep flowing. And I spoke to one person who told me they'd seen a 30% drop off in that offers coming out of the EU institutions. So that's their concern. But the other end, I spoke to an independent contractor in Iraq who said that he's got work he could do if the government he was working with, the government agency, had some funding to commission it. So it really depends. I did a story, I think last week, about the EU's humanitarian air bridge, which is where the EU is basically covering the costs of flying, in this case, medical equipment, wheelchairs and things like that, from Lyon, France to Bangui in the Central African Republic. And speaking to some NGOs about that, I said, what would you like to see? And they just said, we want to be on the plane. Let's not just be supporting large UN agencies and stuff, but let's also be supporting NGOs in this response as well. I think the real risk is for the really small NGOs, the ones who are not necessarily on the radar, or rely on their contacts with bigger NGOs in Europe and America who are racing to put out fires here. I think what I'm hearing is a great concern, and reflected in our tracker figures, is concern for those small NGOs.
Yeah, certainly. And I find that interesting about the keeping people busy with proposals, because if none of those come to fruition with funding, how you can continue to be able to fund that. So I'm assuming there's some kind of work schemes going on to keep organizations busy and paying their employees, even if funding isn't coming.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, each government is doing their own. The EU is launching these hundreds of billions of dollars initiative to try and keep the economy ticking over. So those efforts are underway as well.
Right, which sounds like aren't necessarily being done in other parts of the world where other organizations may be struggling. You mentioned the being on the plane. A big part of global development work has historically comprised of a lot of international travel, right? The international expert flies into country to help run or advise on a program. There's a whole group of consultants who rely on this for the model of doing their work. You wrote a great piece about one such consultant who had an assignment that got interrupted because of travel bans. And so they partnered with a local consultant to provide counsel to continue out the assignment, but from afar. So what are you seeing and hearing, and how organizations and professionals are adjusting to continuing their work despite the inability to travel in most cases?
So this is one of the things we're tracking on travel. So those who've seen travel reduced or eliminated is now at 73%, which is probably predictable. And we're also asking that question you raised about the greater use of local professionals. And at the beginning of this survey a month ago, 46% said that this crisis was leading to a higher use of local consultants. Now it's 55%, so that trend's increasing. It was an interesting story that I did. The case was a British consultant working for a Dutch consultant firm living in Botswana, who had to go and do a project evaluation in Indonesia. So your typical global development scenario, but he had to fly through Johannesburg and then Dubai to get to, and it was just not going to happen. And he'd already engaged a local consultant as a translator, basically. But she had experience with UNDP, and she was clearly capable of perhaps doing more. And so she stepped up and she basically led the field visits. This was early on in the crisis. And since then, and even while this evaluation was going on, even in Indonesia, it became very difficult to move around. So as much as it's a laudable initiative to not have someone fly from Botswana to Johannesburg, to Dubai, to Jakarta, and they spoke on Skype every night instead, it doesn't get around the fact that if you can't go from one suburb to the next of Jakarta, there's still going to be problems. So it shouldn't be seen as a silver bullet, I think, but it's certainly preferable in a situation where international travel is so restricted. It'll be really interesting to track that. And as I said in the piece, actually, why wasn't this happening before? And it's part of the bigger questions that our sector is asking itself at the moment.
Yeah, I'm sure. And I think if you can prove that that model works, it's so many incentives to not spend that money on travel and put more carbon in the air and to build the local capacity. So,
yeah, but I spoke to another consultant in Brussels, and he said when he goes on these kind of missions, he has a slightly different job. He works on private sector evaluations, and so he told me he spends 10 days preparing his missions. And when he goes in Europe, they call them missions. I guess that's the vernacular of our industry. I always find mission a bit of an overstatement, but he spends 10 days preparing a trip, and he back-to-back meetings from 8 in the morning till 8 at night. And then off those meetings, he'll go and interview other people to get a really good sense of the country he's evaluating, the city he's evaluating. But he said some of those exchanges can only be done in person because you might be talking about corruption with someone you've never met before. And the chances of them saying to you over a perhaps not secure internet connection, a stranger on the other side of the world, yes, we have a problem and this is the problem, is slim to none. So he said that kind of stuff's invaluable to be there in person. But he sees at the moment a trade-off between the cost savings you mentioned of not flying around the world, but also that means it's going to take more time to get to the core of what you were doing in the first place by being there. Of course, in the case of a local consultant, you might say they get to the core of the matter even quicker and build trust even quicker with the local language and things like that. So it is a balancing act.
Yeah, it will be interesting to see how this progresses, as you say, as we go forward. And I believe we also asked about the long-term consequences for development in the survey, and 96% said that the pandemic will have significant and long-term consequences for development. So what are people saying these will be?
Well, the use of local contractors and travel's the big one. Travel's the top one. But it's not the only one. We've got a list of, we've given people a list of options. And the other high ranking ones are backsliding on development gains, which we wrote about last week, that development, the work that's been done up till now is under threat, and also ODA levels, the level of aid. And, ODA has been kind of flatlining for years. And now the concern at OECD and elsewhere is that if we go through a recession and where everyone is wedded to this idea of ODA as a percentage of GNI, then GNI shrinks, then ODA could shrink too at a time when it's really needed the most. So there's some of the major concerns. I'm just looking at the other things that have been listed here. 36% say that it will lead to an increased use of mobile money. But as I said, the biggest one is, and 32% say stronger health systems. So in this climate, I think some global health advocates, we just had the World Health Assembly last week. Some global health advocates are saying this is their moment, and there's a moment for everyone to realize prevention is cheaper than cure. And I hope that could lead to more emphasis there. But then does that involve shifts away from other sectors? It's been quite interesting to watch in the European Union's response. They've said that they've mobilized, or they say they secured, I think the word they use is secured 20 billion for the COVID response. But that money is basically money that was already assigned for this year that they're now tweaking. And they sent a letter out from Brussels to all the EU delegations, which we referenced and got access to in the story, basically saying, tell us the projects you've got and tell us how we can turn these into COVID-related projects. But as development professionals would know, how you assign a sector to a project is a movable feast. And when we ask what donors can do, one of the things that I'm hearing from consultants and others is be flexible. If you've engaged us in a project to do X and now the situation is this and our results are going to change, don't hold us into a pre-COVID world. Times have changed. So those dynamics are all at play as well.
Yeah, certainly. And while it might be good news for being able to really invest in health systems, as you say, if that's pulling away funding from other critical areas, which we know that COVID is not just a healthcare issue, right? It's a food security issue, it's an economic issue, education issue.
Well, yeah, it reminds me, I mean, in Brussels every year we have this thing called the European Development Days, and they have a theme each year. And this year was supposed to be, got cancelled, but it was supposed to be climate. And every year you basically see the same people saying the same thing with the different word at the front of their issue, and now it's very much COVID and, gender equality, whatever the people were advocating on anyway. So to be seen how we follow through on that and how we are serious and genuine if we see it as something which is going to turn our sector upside down.
Yeah, I guess it goes to show how interconnected all of these issues are. So what are you looking into in future surveys, and what key questions are top of mind for you right now?
So the next week's one will be, which we're writing at the moment, is about the differences in these responses around different parts of the world. I think that's really important, and it's something that's becoming more pronounced. The other one is travel, because there was a big interest in the consultant story that we mentioned, and people, it's clearly front of mind for people. Even spoke to one person who runs trainings, and they said their job is to go and do a training, but they're based in Europe. They often travel. I think they had one lined up in Ethiopia that got cancelled. But to do a training in the format in which we're talking now is fine if it's two people having a conversation. But the moment you ask someone to sit in front of a computer and listen to a training for any length of time, I think we all are completely zoomed out now. That's the new Friday afternoon feeling, is just Zoom exhaustion and things. For trainers and people whose job it is to engage an audience, that's a real challenge. So that's another dynamic that I think, and this person I spoke to said that they're looking at different models of training. So are we going to have to start incorporating more quizzes and interactive things or videos and stuff, something to break it up, so that we're not asking people to sit in front of a screen and receive information passively, like a learn to drive test in Australia, where you sit in front of the screen and have to say yes or no answers and things like that. That's not going to cut it if you're looking to get a good result, I think. So that's an interesting issue as well that people are facing in a context where you can't necessarily travel.
Yeah, interesting. Well, I think making improvements in how we all communicate through these type of platforms will be good for the long term. So I look forward to reading that and seeing some of the ideas that you find. Well, thank you, Vince, for taking the time to share with us today. If you haven't already, I encourage you to check out the reporting Vince and our colleague MS Smith have done on the COVID-19 Trends Tracker survey. And stay tuned for future pieces digging into more insights as the situation evolves. If you are considering a career move in global development, I would encourage you to check out our career account, which gives you access to jobs, career advice, online events, and more to help you advance in your career. But in the meantime, thank you all for tuning in, and thank you again, Vince, for joining us today.
Thank you. Pleasure. And give us your ideas. I'd add, send us your ideas for trends you're seeing that you'd like us to dig into more. Always welcome.
Great. Thank you.